Good evening. Good evening and welcome to this lecture, which is part of the seminar series that we do in collaboration with the South Asia Initiative at Harvard University, which is a university-wide initiative that sort of connects faculty and students that are doing research and projects on South Asia or in South Asia. And the seminar series is one of their many activities. The seminar series is organized around four heads: urbanization, which is a piece we do here at the GST, water, social entrepreneurship, and health. And so if any of you are interested, let us know or check their website because they have events. We do the urbanization lecture once a month. And that sort of gets posted on the GST website, but if you go to the South Asia Initiative website, you know more about their activities. Our lecturer today, Professor Gavin Shatkin, it's a pleasure to welcome him here at the GST. Gavin is an associate professor of urban planning at the Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan. He is also a faculty associate at the Centers for Southeast Asian Studies and South Asian Studies at Michigan, which is a large center, a very active one, and I know Gavin's played a very important role there, bringing to the fore questions of urbanization in these parts of the world. His research and teaching interests focus on issues related to issues of shelter and infrastructure delivery, the role of community-based and non-governmental organizations in urban development, and the development of new town mega projects in Asian cities. He's focused most of his past research on Southeast Asian cities, Metro Manila, Bangkok, but has recently begun to do research on Indian and Chinese cities as well. And this lecture, which is part of his current, which I think will reflect part of his current research, I think is the new area that he's recently been engaged with. His research generally focuses on three closely related phenomena, all of which relate to the social, economic, and physical transformations associated with the globalization of cities. The first being emerging issues of shelter and basic infrastructure provision in urban regions, particularly in developing countries. The second, the growing role of NGOs and CBOs, which address these issues and in ways they mediate between communities and the government in the community development process. And lastly, changes in urban governance fostered by two contradictory forces faced by governments, which is the pressures to integrate into the global economy by facilitating investment and creating macroeconomic climates conducive to growth, and the pressure for greater accountability and commitment to equity in public policy from grassroots organizations, which is a force that comes from that sort of quarter. His recent research projects have examined precisely these issues, and he's sort of written about them. His book called Collective Action and Urban Poverty, Elevation, Community Organizations in the Struggle for Shelter in Manila, was published by Ashgate in 2007. A research project that he's currently working on, global cities, mega projects, private sector city building in Southeast Asia, and he is currently also editing a book titled Contesting the Indian City, Global Visions and the Politics of the Local. This is sort of doing not only comparative studies, but also focusing on Indian cities. And I think the question he's asking in the title of the lecture today, Are Indian Cities Global?, I think reflects some of this sort of current research. So welcome, Gavin. We look forward to hearing you. Thanks.
So the first thing I was going to say is that I've had somewhat of a change in the title of my presentation. Do we have the power? There we go. So somewhat of a change in the title of my presentation. First of all, I wanted to thank Rahul and everybody at the South Asia Institute for hosting me here and helping me to get here. It's been great meeting a number of you, and I look forward to a stimulating discussion after this talk. The first thing, I've changed the title of my talk somewhat away from the original title of Are Indian Cities Global? I was kind of casting around for a provocative title and something that might spur some thought, but was perhaps a little bit not truly representative of what I'm going to talk about, because I'm not really engaging the question of how global Indian cities are or are not, although I will bring in the question of what the literature on globalization and global cities might mean for Indian cities. So instead, I'm using the title Reading the Indian City, Assessing Recent Research on State, Space, and Citizenship. And what I'm really trying to do in this talk is look at the state of research on the Indian city. And the question that I'm posing is, where are we in our understanding of the contemporary Indian city? What are the major areas of focus in the research that's been done to date? How have we kind of constructed knowledge of the Indian city in research, and what might be some areas for future examination? The context for posing this question is that I have recently begun to do some research in India. Most of my research in the past has been in Southeast Asia, again, Bangkok, Manila, Phnom Penh. But I've begun to do a research project that's looking at the development of large-scale privately built new town developments or privatized new town developments in India, the Philippines, and China. And so I've begun to engage some of the literature on Indian cities. And my initial reaction in reading much of what's been written on Indian cities is, first of all, that there's not as much as I would have expected. That I think there is somewhat of a dearth of literature on what's happening in contemporary post-liberalization Indian cities. On closer examination, there's more than might initially meet the eye, but there's a particular flavor to the literature on Indian cities that I think we need to look at. And so what I want to do in this talk is look at what some of the gaps are, what the state of knowledge on the Indian city is, and what some future directions I think might be. And again, this is, to be forthcoming, the perspective of an outsider. I spent 4 months in Calcutta on a Fulbright scholarship doing this research on new towns last year. And so, again, coming from the outside, but as part of my kind of reaction to seeing that there was somewhat of a dearth in scholarship on the Indian city, one of my responses was to put together a workshop on contestation in post-liberalization Indian cities. And the results of that workshop will be published in this book that Rahul mentioned, Contesting the Indian City, Global Visions and the Politics of the Local, that will soon be contracted with Wiley-Blackwell. And so part of what I'm going to be doing today is presenting some of the kind of background literature review and kind of the conceptual paper that I'm writing for that book. So the questions I'm posing are, where are we in our understanding of the contemporary post-liberalization, or if you prefer, neoliberal or globalizing Indian city? I think there are any number of ways that we could frame what's happening in Indian cities. But where are we in terms of thinking about how cities are changing in terms of their social, political, spatial development in the post-liberalization era, specifically the era since liberalization really took off in 1991? How we endeavor to understand the connection between economic, political, and spatial change, and what insights have emerged and what gaps remain. And so I'm going to begin with some assertions to give you a sense of where I'm going in what I'll be arguing as I go through this talk. And these assertions are, first of all, that the postcolonial literature and the subaltern studies literature resonates deeply in the literature on the Indian city. And the result is that we've seen the development of new lines of inquiry, but also the omission of other lines of inquiry in studies of Indian cities. So I think the postcolonial literature has lent a whole other dimension to the study of Indian cities that I think could inform the study of the way that cities elsewhere are experiencing change. But there are also some omissions that result from I would say, the strong influence of postcolonial literature on studies of the Indian city. The second assertion is that the omissions that exist in the literature have impeded comparison with urban development elsewhere in the world, somewhat to the detriment of theory. And finally, that the most fruitful way forward, I think, is to explore the middle ground between postcolonial theory and contemporary theories of the political economy of urban development. So the context for these explorations is the context of India's contemporary urban development, and I think many of us are familiar with this context to some degree, that there is a tremendous amount of growth and change occurring in Indian cities, tremendous demographic growth, Some 300 to 350 million people will be added to the population of Indian cities by 2040. I believe by that latter date of 2040, India will be predominantly urban, which will lead to a tremendous social and political shifts. But obviously tremendous demands for new infrastructure and tremendous pressures on the development of urban space. Big cities continue to be important, as a number of people have pointed out to me as we were putting together our edited volume. Smaller cities are also very important. In fact, most people continue to live most urbanites continue to live in smaller cities. But I think we shouldn't discount the importance of big cities like Bangalore, Mumbai, Chennai, and others, because they are very influential in terms of their economic impact on the rest of the country, their social impact, but I think also demographically they might be undercounted to the degree that smaller cities, many of the smaller cities actually live within or exist within larger urban regions which are under the sway of these large megalopolises. So I think we shouldn't discount their importance. Of course, we've seen tremendous foreign direct investment since liberalization, 200-fold in real terms since 1991 in terms of total FDI. In recent years, we've seen a tremendous flood of investment in foreign direct investment in real estate. The beginning where in 2004-2005 fiscal year, the Indian government didn't even bother to report it as a separate category, to it being the second largest source of foreign direct investment in 2009-2010, higher than investment in information technology. And in fact, if you count FDI in real estate and construction together, it really is a significant share of FDI, which raises, I think, a whole number of questions. But what it means for what I'm talking about today is that this foreign investment in real estate is but a small part of the investment that's coming in. There's tremendous domestic investment in real estate as well, placing tremendous pressure on urban land markets, leading to tremendous pressures for spatial transformation in Indian cities. And so this has really led to a kind of these pressures for development have led to the emergence of a particular, I think, imaginary of the way that cities are and should change. And this is really, I think, demonstrated by these figures which come from a report that was put together by the McKinsey Consulting Group, who was hired by the Indian government to put this report together on India's urban awakening. So Indian cities are projected to be the real weight and the center of economic growth in India's near future. We need $1.2 trillion in infrastructure investment by that date, by 2030, to realize the potential of Indian cities. That the real estate sector needs to respond by building a quote-unquote new Chicago every year to meet the demand for commercial, office, industrial, and other forms of space. And of course the middle class, the quote-unquote middle class, and I won't get into the whole definitional question of what constitutes the middle class, but according to this report, growing tremendously and very important, increasingly important, both to the corporate sector in terms of the potential to profit from this group, but also from politicians who increasingly see them as an important political force. And yet, the reality of the way that Indian cities are developing continues to reflect a different dynamic than this imaginary, which is being projected, which is the reality that much of urban development continues to be shaped by what Solomon Benjamin, urban planner who is a prominent commentator on Indian cities, is termed occupancy urbanism, which is the dynamic where the vast majority of the people continue to be poor, continue to work in so-called informal economies, which operate in a kind of a legal gray zone or are illegal. And so the illegal occupation of urban space by communities, by settlements, the extra-legal appropriation of space by small businesses, such as you see in this image, extra-legal tapping into infrastructure systems, continues to, and so according to Benjamin, this occupancy urbanism, the dynamic is that because the majority continue to operate outside of the law, but they also exert a great deal of political influence through their vote, this leads to a situation where there's stasis and the efforts to transform Indian cities spatially end up being thwarted. another image to illustrate this. And so what we end up having is a dynamic of emerging contestation over space. And I would characterize this as what I would call a kind of an unstoppable, there's an unstoppable force, immovable object character to the way that Indian cities Indian politics urban politics is playing out. The unstoppable force is this tremendous push to transform urban space to meet a kind of a global ideal on the part of domestic and multinational corporations, many government leaders, and an emerging middle class and civil society. The immovable object is this politics of the poor, which really is not benefiting to a certain degree from a lot of the changes taking place and is staging resistance to that through what Benjamin calls occupancy urbanism, or what others have called vote bank politics. So the result is, again, contestation, evictions and violence. Gautam Pan, for example, estimates that some 45,000 homes were demolished between 2004 and 2007 in Delhi in the run-up to the Commonwealth Games of last year. Middle-class collective action and vigilantism, the emergence of resident welfare associations as a prominent form of political organization, and more darkly, again, vigilantism. Amita Bhaviskar, in her article Between Violence and Desire, begins that article by giving an anecdote of a young slum dweller who is set upon by an angry middle-class mob because he is accused of, or he's suspected of defecating in a public park, and he's set upon by this mob and murdered. So that kind of anecdote kind of illustrates some of the tension that's emerging. The use of the law as a tool to destabilize claims to urban space by the poor. Gautam Pan is a doctoral student at the University of California at Berkeley who's doing a dissertation looking at the way that the Indian Supreme Court and the Delhi High Court have reframed their understanding of the urban poor, moving more and more away from seeing the urban poor as they did during the 1970s and 80s as worthy of state protection, to more and more seeing the urban poor as essentially criminal and in need of some discipline, and using that as a rationale for things like validating evictions. So, the classic example of this contentious politics that's emerging is the case of the Singur site, where you had, this is in the Indian state of West Bengal, outside of Calcutta. You had the Tata Motor Company wanted to build a factory to build its nano car, which is this low-cost car that was to be mass-produced for the Indian middle class. And the West Bengal government, eagerly seeking this investment, sought to acquire a large amount of land held by small farmers through compulsory acquisition, through using the Colonial Era Land Acquisition Act of 1894. This map comes from a presentation given by Solomon Benjamin, and what it shows is the red splotches are the plots where the farmers refused the compensation that was offered, and eventually there was quite a bit of contestation and indeed violence over this project. A number of villagers were killed in clashes over this proposed project, but eventually the project had to be scuttled and moved to another state. So in this case, the forces of political society, of mobilization from below, stop the project. In other cases, projects have gone forward. So we have the irony of, or perhaps we shouldn't see it as ironic in the contemporary world with the case of China, as we all understand, but the irony of the Communist Party of India, Marxist, which rules West Bengal, campaigning for re-election on the basis of its efforts to dispossess farmers of their land in the name of a major industrial investment. And in fact, the CPIM lost the recent elections and is out of power for the first time in 30-plus years, largely as a result of the battle that occurred over this Singur project. And my current research interest is in these new town developments, and we're seeing these private sector built new towns being proposed all over India. I mean, just literally dozens or even hundreds of these projects are being proposed. And these are very large-scale, integrated new town developments, with proposed populations or projected populations from the thousands to tens of thousands, sometimes even hundreds of thousands of people. But in fact, very few of these projects have really come to fruition, in part because of contestation and issues of inability to acquire land because of the existence of communities on sites that are being proposed for redevelopment, and the muddiness of title that exists, which precludes the ability of developers to gain access to large sites. So I like this image. It kind of illustrates the kind of dichotomy of this image of a global transformation that you see and the context which is stymieing that vision of change. The Indian government, of course, is the Indian federal government, of course, and many state and local governments are endeavoring to try to get urban development moving forward. And there are a number of reforms which have the potential to change the dynamics of politics and perhaps enable local governments and corporations to move forward with large projects. So the 74th Constitutional Amendment is significant. I mean, one of the issues that exists in many Indian cities for urban redevelopment efforts is the fact that there is no center of political authority within cities around which a redevelopment agenda can coalesce. So state governments have historically had a lot of power over urban development, but state governments tend to be more responsive to rural electorates, which are the majority of the population, and therefore have not often focused concerted attention on the development of cities. The major municipal authorities, the central municipal authorities in many cities, are municipal commissioners who are IAS officers who are appointed by the state. And so there is no, in the literature on American urban politics, we talk about an urban regime in which mayors act as entrepreneurial politicians who try to bring together a regime, a kind of a governing coalition for urban redevelopment. And so one argument is that the basis for that doesn't exist in the Indian context. So the 74th Constitutional Amendment is significant in that it, for the first time, defines the responsibilities, powers, and revenue sources of urban local bodies. It devolves significant powers and sources of revenue generation to urban local bodies, and it establishes democratic decentralized frameworks for their rule. The JNNURM is a major infrastructure initiative which channels a significant amount of, or began in 2005, channeled a significant amount of infrastructure investment into cities, and it was packaged with a set of administrative reforms that were meant to move development forward. Specifically, reforms that requiring the repeal of the Urban Land Ceiling Regulation Act, thank you, which was instituted in 1976 to place a ceiling on land holdings of any individual. In addition, there are reforms for the computerization of public records and specifically property registration. So reforms that are intended to facilitate the ability of developers to consolidate large parcels of land for urban redevelopment. The RAY project I frankly know less about. It's a major slum redevelopment project or initiative. And again, a significant amount of funding coming from the national government for slum redevelopment. My kind of hypothesis about it is that it's intended to provide some carrot along with the stick. In other words, to provide some funding to allow for resettlement of communities that need to be moved in the name of large-scale infrastructure or urban development projects. So all of these, I think, point towards an effort to move urban redevelopment forward. And we see a number of other initiatives at the local level, including governance initiatives like the BATF and Abide and others in Bangalore. So there's a tremendous amount going on. Tremendous issues of change, of contestation, of changes in urban politics, of governance reform. So the question is, why so little research on these issues? I mean, my first reaction again was, why isn't this being looked at more? And so to put some numbers on this, I did a quick search on the Social Science Citation Index, and I put in the terms globalization, cities, global city, and globalization urban, and then I added India, and then I added China. And I know this is somewhat of a rough set of numbers and a rough indicator, but a tremendous amount more written on using the frame of globalization and cities with reference to China than with reference to India. And in fact, most of those studies on India were actually using the term global city or globalization critically, in other words, critiquing others who use that term in reference to Indian cities as opposed to actually using it as a frame. I also used the term liberalization, neoliberal, to see if there was any difference there. Somewhat of a difference, but still, there's a significant discrepancy in terms of the amount of literature that's being written about contemporary change in politics and spatial restructuring between Indian cities and Chinese cities. Again, a rough indicator, but it accords with my understanding from other indicators. So there's been a flood of books, major studies on land redevelopment, on urban politics, on local land taxation practices, on a whole range of issues related to urban redevelopment in Chinese cities, and we really just have not seen that in reference to Indian cities. Issues of urban villages, eviction and resettlement. Again, these issues come up again and again in literature on Chinese cities, but we see much less on India. So let me quickly review some of the ideas on kind of central debates in contemporary thinking on sociospatial and political change in cities that are experiencing globalization, increasing integration into global economies. And this is a bit of a review. I think many of us are familiar with these ideas. But the central idea, central contribution, initial contribution was Saskia Sassen, her idea of a global city, in which she argues that certain cities emerge as command and control centers in the global economy and begin to transform through the influence, particularly of finance and producer service firms on their economies, which then plays into changes in their spatial structure. We've seen a lot of debate about that idea. One of the major contributions, and I think this accords with a lot of the trend in this literature in recent years, Mark Hughes and Van Kempen talk about the perspective of globalizing cities, the need to recognize that cities integrate into global economies in many different ways, not just as these kind of command and control centers. Cities integrate through investment in services, manufacturing, transnational flows of migrants, and in a number of different ways. But the general focus of this literature is on three kinds of change which emerge in cities that are experiencing this increased international economic integration. The first is social change, that as you see the emergence of a globally connected elite class of managers and financiers and other people who are central to the kind of professional working of the global city, the globalized economy, you see that emerge, but you also see the emergence of a low-wage service sector that provides a lot of the services that the upper-end workers require. And so you see a polarization of incomes in global cities or in globalizing cities. And I'm presenting some very complex debates in a summary fashion. But you see social change, increasing income polarization, which then begins to translate into spatial change, where elite groups begin to begin to kind of colonize parts of the city, or this kind of social inequality translates into a spatial polarization. The phenomenon of gentrification, of urban redevelopment, of the emergence of gated communities is part of this discussion. And you also see political change, where you see an emerging elite within cities beginning to exert disproportionate political influence on the direction of urban policy. And so questions of how does the socioeconomic structure of cities change with liberalization and their increasing integration into world economies? Who wins and loses in that process? How do cities change spatially? How do governance and politics change? These are all questions which are central to a lot of these debates. And again, the debates go back and forth, but what I'm saying is that I don't see these questions asked as centrally or in the same way in literature on Indian cities as I do in other literature on other cities. So how are cities treated in the Indian literature? This is where I want to talk a little bit about the influence of the postcolonial or subaltern studies perspective, which, of course, the subaltern studies group was a group of scholars, of predominantly Indian scholars, who came to be quite influential in the 1970s and 80s, particularly in history, anthropology, literary criticism. And at the heart of these ideas of subaltern studies, as I read them, is a critique of teleology in modernist and Marxist modes of understanding history and social change that emerged from colonial and post-colonial states, as well as from Western academia. In other words, a critique of the assumption that India or any other post-colonial state will uniformly follow the trajectory of development followed by Western countries, the formation of working-class politics, the emergence of a bourgeois politics, and associated political and social change. So as a corrective to this teleological view, subaltern studies writers essentially use two methods. One is to kind of turn the camera around and look at, in a kind of a postmodernist vein, look at the discourses that come out of this kind of modernist or modernization theory or Marxist ways of framing social change. And by turning the camera around, you begin to try to reveal the way that these ways of framing social change, in fact, reflect more on an ideological agenda that's being embraced by the person who is propagating that idea, as opposed to saying as much about the empirical reality on the ground. The second kind of method that subaltern studies scholars have used is to try to restore the voice of the subaltern. In other words, to try to explore the articulations of those people who are not being looked at in the framing of history. The voice of peasants, of the urban poor, of women, of other groups who are disenfranchised. And so you try to reconstruct history by looking at those voices that are excluded, or if you cannot actually recreate the voices that, or find the voices of the excluded, then at the least you try to point out the silences in history that indicate that something is missing. And so probably the most influential thinker in the subaltern studies literature is Partha Chatterjee, and I would say Partha Chatterjee is, to my mind, far and away the most influential thinker or theorist in terms of informing the literature on Indian cities. And Chatterjee's work is essentially revealed, or worked to reveal, how post-colonial identity is founded in a response to the modernism of an emerging national elite in India. And essentially the way that a rejection, a kind of a grassroots rejection of this modernism it continues to exercise a great deal of influence over politics to this day. So in his book, The Nation and Its Fragments, he talks about an internal and external domain in Indian national identity. The external domain is the domain of the economy, of society, of larger political institutions, dominated by the state or previously by colonial rulers. And the internal domain is the domain of culture, of religion, of the family, of community, of caste, that is informed by the grassroots and is really rooted in the grassroots. And so building on that idea, Sudipto Kaviraj talks about the way that contemporary or post-colonial urban politics is informed by a kind of a disjuncture between the kind of grassroots understanding or grassroots kind of ideology and this modernist ideology that's being imposed from the post-colonial state. So a great example of that is the work of this dynamic is the work of Sanjeev Vidyarthi, who's going to be coming and speaking here, I think, in a couple of months. And what Sanjeev does in his research is he shows very concretely how this works out in looking at the fate of the neighborhood unit concept in India. So the neighborhood unit concept, of course, is an American idea that originated in the work of Clarence Perry in the 1930s, but it became a kind of foundational idea in the way that neighborhoods should, or communities should be organized in India, and a kind of a foundational concept in Indian urban planning. And what Sanjeev shows in his research is the way that modernist idea ends up being subverted as, for example, what's supposed to be a public secular park ends up being turned into the site of a Hindu temple, or a group of squatters take over part of the settlement over here, a group of vendors take over here. And through these kind of people expand their houses to accommodate multifamily types of settings or extended family types of arrangements. So through these multiple acts of what Sanjeev calls acts of appropriation, you see this modernist ideal end up being subverted and transformed into something that reflects much more a kind of an indigenous ideal of urban development. More recently, Chatterjee's talked about the idea of political society, which is essentially describes this dynamic where, again, the vast majority, urban poor, live and work outside of the law, but their vote enables them to continue to assert a great deal of power, especially over local politics and kind of local level, neighborhood level bureaucracies in a way that allows them to continue to exercise some agency. So I think these ideas have really had a tremendous influence on theorization about the way that cities are experiencing change currently. And I'd say there are two predominant and closely related interests that have emerged from this set of perspectives. And again, you see Chatterjee and Kaviraj and other post-colonial theorists cited again and again in many of these studies. So the first of these interests is in discourses of urban development and the production of knowledge about the city. So an interest in the way that the state or state entities use discourses, certain discourses of urban development to try to drive through a modernist transformation of the city, and the production of knowledge. So the way that technologies of the survey and of archiving essentially are used to shape the way that knowledge is created about the city in order to legitimize certain uses of space and delegitimize other uses. So Pushpa Arabindu, for example, in a recent study published in the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, talks about the way that the city of Chennai has pursued a redevelopment plan for Marina Beach that she says is framed around a kind of a bourgeois conception of public space that she traces directly back to the colonial era. And she essentially argues that the fact that this bourgeois conception of public space doesn't accord with the way that people actually use the space or relate to the space is the fundamental reason that these redevelopment plans for Marina Beach have in fact failed. A second area of interest is in the agency of micropolitics. In other words, the ways in which, again, the grassroots groups of the urban poor are able to use their political influence to shape urban space in contravention of efforts to modernize urban space. So Jonathan Anjaria, in a dissertation that he recently completed at the University of California, Santa Cruz, looks at hawkers in Mumbai and the way that through their ability to negotiate with what he calls street-level bureaucrats, kind of very local-level politicians, and particularly the police, they're able to continue to exist and ply their trades despite the efforts to globalize Mumbai and cleanse its public spaces. And Benjamin's idea of occupancy urbanism, I think, fits in with this whole mode of analysis. So I think these post-colonial perspectives on urban development have actually been extremely fruitful, and they've provided some really interesting insights and useful insights. And I think they've acted as a corrective to the tendency in some of the literature on globalization and cities to see globalization as a kind of a uniform and monolithic force which sweeps aside local context and which really don't give the local a lot of agency. You see a lot of respect and consideration of local agency and an understanding of the mechanisms through which people exercise agency at the local level in these analyses. But I did want to raise a couple of critiques, and I should say that these are not critiques of subaltern studies methods or literature per se, because it would not be fair to critique the subaltern studies work for not answering questions that they didn't pose in the first place. Rather, it's a critique of some of the ways in which these literatures have been employed in the study of cities. So the first critique is the question of where is the state in these analyses. There's a strange way in which the state is both omnipresent and absent in these analyses. Omnipresent in as much as the kind of machinations and this modernist ideology of the state is used to explain a whole range of different types of things, from kind of elite mobilizations, resident welfare associations, to a whole range of efforts at urban redevelopment that originate in the local state, in the state level governments, in national initiatives, as well as in the private sector and in the work of civic groups. So, there's the state is omnipresent, but yet strangely also absent in as much as there's not much consideration of really who are state actors and what are their interests and what are they trying to accomplish and how might the context in which they're operating be changing. And so I think it's legitimate to ask whether it continues to make sense to see the national state as pursuing a uniform ideologically driven agenda of nationalist modernism when you see so many other things going on in Indian cities. You see, first of all, the national government devolving some of it, or many of its responsibilities to local governments, and states, in some cases, doing the same. You see private sector actors playing a very profound and dramatic role in urban redevelopment efforts in many cities. And one can argue, I think, that private sector entities don't operate in any ideological mode. They are interested in profit and profit alone. And also the way in which a lot of development that's taking place in India right now is taking place in kind of political gray zones, places like Gurgaon, where the reason the development is happening there is that you don't have a strong state which is directing development. And so where is the state? We need to begin to rethink the way we're understanding the state. How have liberalization and urban reform changed the dynamics of state-society relations, and has this led to changes in the dynamics explored by postcolonial theorists? Issues of local politics, land development, and the emergence of real estate interests are central, and again, I don't see those issues being discussed very much in much of this literature. The second is a question of where is urban space? Where is urban space? So there's, to a large degree, oddly, very little consideration of the way that urban space is changing, and very little examination of an actual on-the-ground assessment of what models of urban development are being employed in Indian cities. What kind of models are international architecture and planning firms bringing in? What types of models are urban developers bringing in? And how is this actually changing spatial relations within cities? So what I'm calling for is what I would call a pragmatic approach to analyzing Indian cities. And so I'd say that this pragmatic approach, I think, needs to seek the ground between postcolonial and political economy approaches, and to pose the question essentially, how has power restructured in post-liberalization Indian cities, and with what impact on the strategies and objectives of the postcolonial state? So we need to maintain an interest in the way that the dynamics of the postcolonial state that are described by Chatterjee and others and Benjamin continue to shape the way that urban development happens. But we also, I think, need to be alert to the way that new forces are beginning to transform some of those dynamics. How have state actors sought to adapt to the dynamics of vote bank politics through these reform initiatives? What new discursive strategies have emerged to enable them to do so? What impacts have these changes had on popular mobilizations? So I think we need to take this pragmatic approach, and I think it needs to be grounded in empirical investigation. That if we're going to build more useful theories of the way that cities are changing, this needs to come about, I think, through an investigation of what's actually going on the ground. And I think there are a number of young scholars who are beginning to take this task up. And I would point to Lisa Bjorkman, who recently completed or is completing a dissertation at the New School. A lot of these people are people who are dissertating right now or have recently finished their dissertations. Lisa Weinstein, who recently completed her PhD in sociology from University of Chicago. Asher Kurtner from UC Berkeley. Gautam Pandu, I also mentioned, from UC Berkeley, and a number of others. So I think that there's an emerging literature on Indian cities which I think is going to really transform the field in the coming years. So what I'd like to do right now is present some of the findings of some of the more interesting studies which I've come across, and some of these are work from dissertations, and some of these are actually papers that are going to appear in the edited volume that I'm currently working on. So all of these are looking at the question of how political power and urban space are restructuring in contemporary Indian cities. So the first finding that I think is coming out from some of the work that's being done now is to understand the tentative efforts to rescale urban governance through program innovations and ad hoc decision-making. So again, you know, a lot of the interest in the kind of international literature on contemporary urban redevelopment is interested in the way that urban politics restructures in order to enable development to take place. And part of this is a discussion of the rescaling of the state, which of course Neil Brenner, your own Neil Brenner, has made a fundamental contribution to. The idea of the urban regime also comes out of this, and once again Susan Feinstein, who is here at the GSD, has been fundamental to that as well. But the idea that that you need to kind of have a governance structure around which elite collective action and kind of capitalist collective action can bring about transformations. So again, in the absence of that type of structure in Indian cities, I think what's been found is that there are a number of interesting kind of ad hoc ways or program initiatives which have tried to achieve the same thing. So one very interesting finding is from Lisa Weinstein's dissertation, in which she talks about the idea of an entrepreneurial bureaucrat. So she looks at the case of the Dharavi redevelopment project, and you saw this dynamic in I believe the video Slum for Sale. Dharavi Slum for Sale was shown here recently, and this really plays out there, where a New Jersey-based developer, Mukesh Mehta, comes to Mumbai and tries to initiate this Dharavi redevelopment project, and essentially through his ability to develop networks with prominent politicians, with developers, with prominent citizens and capitalists, almost experienced some success in bringing about this very transformative urban redevelopment project. And I think there are a number of other examples one could give. Asher Gertner's dissertation looks at the Delhi's Bhagidari scheme, which is a scheme that's essentially tried to facilitate and encourage elite and middle-class collective action around local development as a counter to this dynamic of vote bank politics. A second interesting finding is the emergence of what I call network politics in the urban, again, in this urban political vacuum, in this vacuum that's created where there's no kind of coherent center to reform politics in many Indian cities. So a doctoral student who's working with me, Neha Sami, is looking at the case of Magarpata, which is a major new town development that's been built in Pune. And essentially what she finds is that the one individual, Satish Magar, who's the leader of this community of farmers, and what happened in the Magarpata case is that a group of farmers actually formed a farmers collective which then was able to pool the land to engage in this new town development, which is one of the largest and most significant new town developments that's actually been built in any Indian city. And this Satish Magar was critical to that, his ability to network both within his community to build a kind of a coalition within the community around this project, as well as to build links to prominent politicians and investors, was what really allowed this to occur. And really, this project, this Magarpata project, relative to anything else that's happened in Pune, is quite transformative. So again, in the absence of the city government's ability to get large-scale projects done, you see these kind of network politics emerging. Another interesting study is done by Lorena Searle, who recently completed her dissertation at the University of Pennsylvania. And she's looking at real estate developers, one of the few studies that looks at real estate developers and how they operate and what their objectives are. And one of the interesting findings that came out of her study is the way in which, because of the fact that land title is so muddy in many Indian cities and consolidating land is so difficult, developers continue to see their primary function as land banking. Domestic Indian developers continue to see their primary function as land banking. In other words, they once they are able to actually consolidate a piece of land of any considerable size, their impulse is to simply develop it as quickly as possible and then pass it on. And so they tend not to be interested in architecture. They tend not to be interested in urbanism. They look at the building as a way, as she puts it, a key to unlock the value of the land. And so this helped me to understand something that came up in a conversation I had. Swefe Ren, who's a sociologist at the Michigan State University, recently published a book on transnational architectural production in China. And she came to visit Calcutta while I was there. And while she was there, she posed the question to me. She said, "Why isn't there any architecture in China, in India?" You know, she'd been to Delhi, she'd been to Gurgaon, she'd been to Mumbai, and she asked, "Why isn't there any architecture here?" And I think this kind of mindset of developers that once you get the land, you're not interested in, and again, this creates a lot of issues and contestation between international real estate investors and local real estate investors, that Indian real estate developers tend not to be interested in urban design, in landscaping, in project management. And so, this is just something that really struck me when I was in India as well. This is an image from Gurgaon, which is supposed to be the big global fancy development in all of India. And yet when you leave these glass and steel monoliths that mark that landscape, you get out onto the street and you don't see a sense of urban design. You don't see an attention to the spaces in between the building. And in fact, the buildings themselves, I think, I'm not an architect, so I won't comment at length, but one can question whether you see as much attention to architecture as you do, for example, in China, where architecture is obviously highly valued. Another example, in Gurgaon, you see these kind of glass and steel stalks here and there, but the in-between spaces, you see interspersed kind of public spaces that are not particularly given much attention, and these kind of slum communities that have sprouted up to service this area. And in my research, I'm interested in these new town developments. And in that research, I'm interested in part in the way that this kind of local politics and this vote bank politics that's been written about so extensively interacts with these large-scale developments. So again, in Calcutta, there have been a number of major redevelopment projects, private sector-built new towns that have been proposed, but very few have moved forward. One of the few examples is the one that you see here. This is Calcutta Riverside project. But one of the things I'm interested in about this project is the way that actually the development is only moved forward through a process of negotiation with the local context, where surrounding communities have essentially really negotiated directly, have been able to use their political influence to negotiate with the developers to make a number of concessions. For example, they've negotiated to have a large kind of public space here that's historically been used by local communities for things like religious festivals maintained, and I believe it's about 25% of the land in this development. A major kind of market and transportation hub was developed by the developer for the local community in response to local demands. The developer has also allowed local communities egress across the site in various places because of the reliance of many of these communities on resources from the river to a large degree. There's also been, this is actually on a site called Bata Nagar. This is a bata factory, and the bata workers who used to live all over the site have also been given a housing package adjacent to the site. And so all of this, I believe, has occurred through a process of negotiation with this kind of dynamic of local politics. So I'll end with a couple of points, and it's, again, what I'd like to suggest is that we again need to seek the middle ground between an understanding of this post-colonial politics and the way that it is being reshaped and transformed through these processes of tremendous change. And I'd like to form some tentative hypotheses about what's happening in post-liberalization urban Indian cities, and these are just a few that one could think of. That first of all, the hodgepodge of reform and programmatic initiatives in urban governance, in fact, reflect an effort to transcend the discursive disjunctures of the modernist nation-state. That to a certain degree, initiatives like this privatization of planning, the pursuit of these privatized developments, is a way to try to skirt around the obstacles that that state actors face in trying to implement modernist redevelopment projects by putting development authority in the hands of somebody else, in the hands of developers who are not subject to the same type of democratic control. that ad hoc network regimes are emerging as powerful forces for change in the political vacuum. Again, that we're seeing in this kind of interim period where governance reforms have not yet taken hold. And I think, the jury is still out as to what impact a lot of these reforms, like the JNNURM and the 74th Constitutional Amendment, are eventually going to have. They'll take a while to play out. But in the meantime, you're seeing these network mobilizations of elite actors, which are beginning to really bring about some significant changes, and that's worthy of some more attention. And then finally, new discourses, and I didn't have a chance to talk about this, but discourses of a slum-free city, of an Asian century, are emerging as powerful tropes in countering vote bank politics. So one thing that I'm really interested in is the way that these ideas of the Shanghaiification or the Singaporeanization of Indian cities, how effective those are as kind of rhetorical devices in trying to bring about urban change. The overarching hypothesis, of course, is that we're seeing the rise of money politics in urban development that sometimes coexist with and sometimes replaces the politics of post-colonial nation building. And I think we can predict with some assurance that this emerging politics will be accompanied by renewed efforts to empower elite and middle-class groups in urban governance and to incentivize entrepreneurialism in political institutions. It will also, I think, accompany intensified efforts to relocate communities and acquire land by both government and private sector actors, as well as intensified mobilization of both elite and low-income communities in protection of their spaces. So I think this is only the opening round of contestation around these issues. And if this is true, then I think the questions we need to ask are what conceptual frameworks will best inform agendas of urban action, and what can we learn from the Indian experience as well for the development of urban theory more broadly. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Gavin. I think what I'm going to do is quickly open it up to the audience, and we can carry on a conversation. So, questions? Joyce?
Yeah, well, I mean, the class structure of the towns themselves, I would say, is definitely, again, quote unquote, consumer class. It's both, I think, this kind of emerging elite within Indian cities who are beginning to make a lot of money in high tech and other industries and in business. But also, there are a lot of NRIs, non-resident Indians, who are buying into these properties, often as an investment outlet. And so it's varied. But I mean, there are a whole range of issues that come up with those projects. They tend to fare fairly well, at least in Calcutta. They've fared fairly well in terms of the units being sold. But what you see in some cases is that a number of the units actually remain unoccupied, in large part because they're being used as an investment vehicle as opposed to an actual place to live. And so then that raises a whole other range of questions.
But can I just sort of pick up on that, because you touched upon the middle class and you said that's much more complex to define, and I'm not going to get into that.
Right.
And it might be worth sort of getting you to share your observations about that, because what is really driving this sort of new shift and this new imagination that you referred to in the end, the vote bank politics, and you also brought up the question of architecture, this idea of a slum-free city, the metaphors of Shanghai and Dubai, which really are a shift in perceived vote banks among politicians from the very poor, who
Right.
actually are not. They're. I mean, it's brutal what's being done with the poor in India today,
Yes.
because this is shifting to the middle class, and there is no correlation between what is the definition of the middle class and the habitat they currently occupy. So I would argue all of Dharavi, which is a slum, is really middle class because they have access to the formal economy in terms of leveraging loans from banks and all of that. And for the middle class, I mean, I think in India what's emerging is urban India is a terrible place for the poor. It's a great place for the poor who migrate because of distress migration from rural areas, perhaps, and for the very rich. The middle class that's growing enormously, especially in cities, are aspiring towards predictable infrastructure, predictable housing,
Yeah.
and this new imagination, in a funny way, is aimed at this sort of nebulous or sort of complex definition of what might be the middle class. So
Yes.
I just would be curious to see how you perceive that in the time that you were there, of what people were referring to as a middle class.
I'm not sure that people really know what they're talking about when they talk about a middle class. I mean, I think your observation that that Dharavi is middle class is interesting and in some ways provocative. But I mean, I for one have looked for some good solid data on and to a certain degree it's about income, money, how much money do people have. That's the and when I think about it, part of what I'm thinking about is the whole politics of property. I mean, that class of I think of that class of people who are, you can also call them a consumer class, but who can think of property as a commodity and as an investment, and who therefore have a stake in all of this transformation, as opposed to seeing it as something that's displacing them. They see it as something
That
that's
is
facilitating and potentially enriching them.
And that's why that debate about Dharavi and Mukesh Mehta was a very interesting one, because it was divided. It wasn't like, civil society has projected that in ways, I think, that can be contested. And I think that comes from exactly what you're describing, because the perceptions people who live there have of what's being provided for them is quite different from, say, the NGOs working on the grassroots, perhaps. And so, this is go on, respond.
Yeah. I mean, another reason I think that we don't see as much research on some of these issues as you see in other places is, to some degree, also the illegibility of Indian cities. I mean, it's hard to get good data on a lot of these types of things. And so, this whole question of who the consumer class is, who the middle class is. And I actually asked a number of real estate developers who their market was, and how they figured out whether a particular project was going to be viable. And at least in Calcutta, their answer was, oh, we don't do market research. We build and they come. We just assume that there's a market, that the market is endless. But I think that's an open question as to how deep the market for those types of projects is, and therefore how wide a spectrum of the population those projects are catering to.
Other questions?
Me? Okay. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about retail. I guess that kind of folds into the last question, but I feel like there's a lot of discussion about hawkers and the hawker culture as part of that narrative of the decentralized, kinetic city. But I'm wondering if in your study about new development, you've seen new modes of retail. Are there malls? Are there shopping strips? How does retail sort of manifest itself in these new forms of development in India?
Well, it's a huge part of it, and it's a huge, I think, part of the discussion of public space and the perception that there aren't sufficiently tamed and cleansed public spaces in Indian cities. So malls have definitely become a major form of public space for a large segment of the population. Yeah, I mean, if you go to Gurgaon, there's a famous strip of, 7, 8, 9 shopping malls all strung out in a row. And the question is there a market for all of this? Again, this gets back to the question of whether Indian developers do market research. But a lot of them are, a lot of the malls are fairly well patronized. So, I mean, But that also raises another interesting question about a lot of the urban redevelopment, which I don't know if you had in mind. But that's the question of what do people want in terms of retail? So do people want a shopping mall type of environment, or do they prefer to patronize the hawkers and the small stalls? And in fact, I think one of the challenges that a lot of the master plan new developments like Calcutta Riverside faces is that a lot of the Indian middle class continues to rely on hawkers and vendors and the myriad people who kind of show up at the door delivering the milk and the newspaper and the, everything you could possibly, this endless stream of servants and hawkers or vendors who come to your door to service your daily needs. And I think that's something that is very much a part of arguably middle-class culture that doesn't fit into this ideal of a master plan development which excludes the poor.
How welcome is the quote-unquote slum to the middle class in terms of development? And how many of the kind of moneyed subaltern middle class people who write about subaltern narratives, how willing are they to move into that kind of environment and kind of develop it in terms of money? And is there even a hierarchy for that kind of thing, a kind of like gentrification within in Indian cities?
Is there a gentrification? Now, can you, so you're asking specifically with relation to the slum middle class that Rahul
well, perhaps like
to?
gentrification is a word that reflects an American context.
Right.
So maybe that word is not even relevant at all. Maybe I shouldn't have mentioned it. But in terms of the places that you showed with these neighborhoods, or maybe I shouldn't be using the word neighborhood either because it's an American context. But the pictures you showed of people living together and those streets, how public are those streets? Could I, as a middle class, quote unquote middle class Indian, move into that neighborhood? Would I be welcome there? Would I want to move in there? Is that classy place to live? Can you reflect on that?
Yeah. Well, that particular area is in Calcutta, and it's a predominantly Muslim part of Calcutta, which is overwhelmingly low income. So I don't think that's a place that, Calcutta at least has very, and I feel like I should also have Rahul pitch in for these answers as well, because I'm sure he has many different perspectives, but there are very distinctly kind of middle class areas of Calcutta. There does tend to be an intermingling because there is a kind of a spatial dependency between the poor and the rich, which necessitates some proximity, but you do see distinct middle class, older neighborhoods, as well as these kind of new developments popping up. So,
I think in many ways your question, I think that this clarification, and I'm not sure what the answer is either, and I know Gavin's obviously struggling with it because he not ducked it, but he qualified it as being complex. Just
right,
the idea of the
I
middle
can
class, yeah. And it's a complex one. So you're in your mind separating people who live in the slums and the middle class. I'm sort of arguing. You're saying
if they do mix.
Absolutely. Both at the place of work, and that's why I said there's no correlation between the house. So when you walk in Dharavi, it's not uncommon to walk into a house with microwaves and a fridge and a kid surfing on the internet on a Macintosh. But the investment in the house doesn't occur because there's no tenure on land, etc. And so they see themselves being able to actually aspire to some of these visions because they also have access now to finance through loans and in the altered economy. So it actually muddles that definition a little more. And so these are kind of intuitive, experiential kinds of readings, and they might not even be accurate. They're more intuitive, and I think the lack of data is a real limitation. For any city like Mumbai, when even the chief planner, if you ask them what is the population of Mumbai, they'll talk with margins of 2 million people. It could be between 13 and 15. Most cities around the world are less than 1 million people. So, that's the kind of lack of data that we operate with, which is problematic, actually. And I think part of what Gavin has, I think, really clearly articulated is the lack of literature on the Indian city, and the two perspectives are actually limiting in many ways. And I think this is a much richer field.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Thank you. That was a great presentation. You titled it "Reading the Indian City," and yet a lot of the transformations, the urban transformations, were outside municipal jurisdictions as we know them. I mean, Singur, the contestation happened in a village.
Right.
And my own dissertation is looking at the transformations happening along infrastructure corridors. I'm sure a lot of these new towns are happening in peri-urban areas.
Yes.
So I'm wondering how these kinds of transformations are unsettling the familiar notion of the city or even the urban, right? Because we have these dichotomous conceptual frames of the rural and the urban, and yet a lot of these transformations happening in India and China really defy these frames. I was wondering if you could talk a little to that.
Yeah. Well, I think, as I mentioned at one point, and by the way, reading the Indian city, I actually meant to change that to reading Indian cities, which doesn't really get at your comment because there is no uniform Indian city. I should clarify that. But I mentioned at one point that, I mean, I think it's a very important kind of potential area for research is an understanding of why we do see that a lot of these large-scale redevelopment projects are coming up not within cities themselves, but rather on the urban fringe. And this, I think, accords with a lot of what's happening. I mean, again, most of my research is in Southeast Asia. And there's a whole literature on this, on the peri-urban interface and the way that the kind of grayness of the legal and political framework in some of these peri-urban areas actually enables a lot of types of development that you wouldn't see elsewhere. That kind of peri-urban towns tend to have much looser kind of frameworks of land use codes and building codes and things like that. And so it enables developers who wouldn't be able to operate in an urban setting to do things that they wouldn't otherwise. And so, I mean, Gurgaon, I mean, I visited the Haryana Urban Development Corporation office there, and this is the main planning entity that's really shaping, from a state perspective, what's going on there. And there's very little capacity, and the entire structure is centered around facilitating DLF and Unitech to basically do what they want to do otherwise. And so, obviously, that couldn't happen in Delhi. And Gurgaon exists because it's just across the border in Haryana from Delhi. Otherwise, Gurgaon would not exist. So, I mean, I think, yeah, that's a very important dynamic, yeah.
But I mean, absolutely right. But this is a very interesting question, Sai, and again pointing to the condition that there's not enough research. I think it's really important because, I mean, I think if you look at Gurgaon, it's a very unique, I mean, people actually are modeling themselves on Gurgaon. Gurgaon happened when not only did DLF exist and Unitech exist, it happened in this sort of real gray period between our decision to liberalize and any regulations even coming into place. We're seeing it manifest itself now. And so because of it being next to a large metropolitan area that could take the energy of Delhi and the demand, the fact that it was another state that could set up its own regulations, the fact that there were active operators there who had political clout but had also the experience of investment, had failed miserably in the 70s and 80s, and then but had the staying power to come and play themselves out in the 80s and 90s. I think DLF is a very unique case. What is happening largely, which is not actually happening, they're plans, and my friend Dennis Piper's here from Sasaki, who's been involved in a number of these projects, and many other large firms here who are being employed by developers to use architecture to unlock this potential. But also, as I think he'll testify, others will testify, SOM will testify, there is a huge lag time between the time they make these plans and anything that happens on the ground. So the Bata project is, again, so these are land conversion projects because these are industrial lands, highly contested, especially in the present climate. To make a master plan when there's a window of opportunity and get sanctions is an assurance of that value. because in the Indian judiciary system, to reverse those sanctions once you've got them is very complex. And so a lot of developers are seeing this as an opportunity of conversion within our liberalized economy in this particular moment before actually good regulations are in place. And Jagdish Bhagwati, who's an economist, questioned this. He said, what's unique in India as compared to China is that the special economic zones are, he said he called the special economic zones in India like putting scaffolding in a building after it was built, not to build it, where the Pearl River Delta area was about a different kind of synergy through infrastructure when China was beginning to before China really opened up and liberalized. And so this is a guise, actually, and I mean, in my reading at least of the special economic zones, the political condition is so contested, unstable, in a mutinous democracy that people are betting their money on just converting land right now. And the master plans that corporations are being asked to make are often to facilitate that. And therefore, there's this huge lag time. And I think most firms that work in India are really frustrated by this. But the reason for this is that they are sort of putting a forward bet on this, you know. And so it's a much slower process. In a democracy, of course, it's different. So, I mean, that's my read anyway, Gavin.
Yeah.
No, sorry, she's been waiting also.
Hi. Thank you for that very provocative talk. I think I've never seen literature in Indian cities condensed so well into a presentation. I had two questions for you. And the first one was, I was hoping that you'd make some comments on infrastructure, because for me, amongst this entire real estate boom, and the two questions that you posed about where is the state and where is urban space, infrastructure plays a really key role, because that's the moment when you don't have infrastructure that you ask where the state is. And the second, that it lays the spine for the expansion of urban space, right? So developers are always fighting over manipulating roads towards their areas or buying up land based on new electric lines or roadways coming up. So I wonder what your observations about infrastructure were when you were doing interviews. And the second one was, I noticed a thread that you set up initially in your presentation but didn't follow through on, which was the comparative perspective. And I'd love to hear what you had to say a little more about that as well. Especially you started off with the entire comparison of China and India and the number of articles. And you said that Indian cities have a lot to learn or can benefit from a comparative perspective. And could you say a little bit more about that too, please? Thanks.
Okay. Well, I'll answer your first question from a comparative perspective, which is the relationship between land development and infrastructure, because you're right. This is where the question of where the state really becomes a pointed one. And so, I mean, again, in my research in Southeast Asia, I've also been looking at new town developments in Manila and Bangkok and elsewhere. And one of the interesting things I've found is that what you see is that there in Manila, for example, in the absence of a strong state to push forward large infrastructure initiatives, what you're seeing is that developers are actually building infrastructure on an urban and a regional scale. And I've written an article about this in reference to Manila. So, for example, Ayala Land, which is the largest developer in Manila, which is building a number of new towns around Manila, is also involved in various consortiums and initiatives to build a regional rail line, a metro system, which link up some of its large-scale new town developments to the rest of the city. And I wonder whether that's something that you might see starting to come up in India as well. Essentially, what you're doing is you're extracting value from the land to pay for infrastructure, but you're paying for infrastructure often that only caters to a certain segment of the population that's using these elite spaces. And you also see the same thing happening in China. In China, and I've been looking into the kind of model of land development there, you see, essentially, I've just spent some time in Chongqing this summer, and they've got a model of development there where the city has spun off a number of infrastructure development corporations, and it grants these development corporations land in exchange for their commitment to build infrastructure. And so they're essentially using their powers of land development to extract value from land to pay for the infrastructure that is their main in fact, their main task. So you have state enterprises which are engaged in very much commercialized for-profit development, which they then use those revenues to essentially pay off bonds that they've used to build infrastructure. And so again, I believe, I came across a dissertation or a master's thesis that's being done at MIT that I think is looking at the application of that model to Indian cities, which I think would be fascinating to see if and how that's being done. But I don't see that kind of thing happening in India yet. But infrastructure, I think, does bring up the question of the role of the state in a very pointed way in the Indian case. So, for example, that Calcutta Riverside project that I'm looking at, the actual development of that project hasn't led to a great deal of social displacement because it's an actually existing factory land which is owned by the Bata Corporation. And the existing workers in the Bata factory are being rehoused on site, and they're quite happy, apparently, with the terms of their resettlement. That project has not been controversial for that reason. But what's happening is that once that project gets built, the road that's feeding that site is suddenly going to be intensely congested. And so there are proposals to widen that road. And in that road widening, tens of thousands of small businesses and households will be displaced. And so, this $1.2 trillion in investment that the McKinsey report says needs to be spent in order to kind of meet the economic potential of Indian cities is going to come at the cost of a tremendous amount of political contestation and wrangling, because infrastructure, road widening, the building of rail systems, this is where you see very large-scale displacement, often far exceeding the scale of displacement of the real estate development projects. And so I think you're going to continue to see that play out, and that is going to be a continuing kind of source of tension and a hindrance to the realization of the real estate development projects. With regard... Yeah, okay, I'll finish there. With regard to the comparative perspective, I think it's precisely by looking at these questions of models of land development and the relationship between land development and infrastructure. That's one set of questions you could pose, comparing, for example, the Chinese models and the Philippine model that I just described with what's happening in India, and asking questions about what's applicable where. I think also questions of urban governance, there's a lot of potential for looking at different models.
Last question.
I was also going to bring up the infrastructure thing, but also tie it to public realm. So we've been involved, the public realm. So we've been involved in a development project outside Mumbai, and very, very different to what you showed. Ours is driven by a sort of ecological idea around stormwater management and public space and the street, or ideas about what a street could be. And our client is able to gain control of the land. It's sort of unproductive agricultural land, and there is a series of villages who used to farm the land or struggled and have changed their businesses. And we worked very hard to protect these villages, because as development occurs, their economics completely transform themselves, and they evolve in different ways. And we've done our plan so that they can just be absorbed into the fabric of the new community eventually over time. But the problem is that, and where he struggles and where we struggle with him, is that the government and their infrastructure plans are in a completely different world. There's no coordination or integration or even interest in doing that. We were 99% through our work on the plan, and we were emailed a PDF of a 10-lane highway going right through multiple villages with a absolutely stupid metro idea down the middle divider lane of the highway where no one is, with stations serving nothing. And it was just a given. And we don't know where it's going or why it's there. And it's being proposed by the very entity that's supposed to be looking after, the interests of the villages and the community and the larger infrastructure. So our developer struggles in that he has to provide the infrastructure of his settlement, and then issues of affordable housing and all of that become very difficult to accomplish.
Is there a question? Well,
Yes, sharing.
yeah.
No, thanks very much,
Well,
Dennis. Yeah.
I guess my response would be, what politics produced that? And what's behind that? Is that simply a kind of a bureaucratic, technocratic response to a problem that might not exist, or that's being invented, or is there something else going on? And I guess, one of the questions I have is, okay, we don't know where that's going to go, but who owns the land where it's going to go is one question. I don't know. I wonder if that's part of the equation.
So, Gavin, thanks for that. I mean, I think really I would just second that this is a great contribution, because I think the way you've systematically taken stock of what's happened, highlighted the lacunas, will be a great contribution, because I think one of the problems in India is also just the lack of capacity, and I think it's very high on the agenda of the government to ramp up education, and planning capacity is so low that the GNRUM that you talked about, it can't even get the money out of the door because there's no capacity to write proposals to take that money, and so you're beginning to get a centralization of that, the use of that money in this kind of form of big infrastructure that becomes an outlet because of the lack of capacity to kind of decentralize it, which is actually its intent. And so I think the book can to begin to spur a discussion both towards a theoretical framework to look at our cities, but also, jumpstart processes of highlighting the lacunas in data, and I mean a whole spectrum of things. I mean we are way behind, and so we really look forward to your book. Thank you very much for taking this time and sharing this work with us. Thanks.